Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the May meeting of the Historical Society. Those of you at home and the dozen or so people that are here. Those at home didn't have to get wet. Those that are here didn't get wet. It was very good. A reminder, I talked last time about that little booklet pamphlet called Yankees and Loyalists on the walk, the trip that four men made in 1830 from Ottawa to Kingston so they could use the bank in Kingston. This is while the canal was being built, and it is a fascinating story, and it's well worth the read just to remind what that country used to be like before there were roads and before the canal was had been completed. If you're interested in a copy, send an email request to kingstonhs@gmail.com and we'll get a copy to you. Secondly, the sad part of the meeting, we decided to start noting deaths of members, and we have three since the last time that I had a list. John Meisel, well-known academic, and I think the obituaries published in the media cover his life and all that he did. Don Smithy was one of our quiet members, and it wasn't until I read his obituary that I found his life had been really spent with local historical groups and heritage groups. And it's one of those when I wish I'd spoken to him before I knew all of that, before his death. And the third one last week of Captain Brian Johnson, who was our 2010 Historical Society Award winner, founder of the Wolfe Island Historical Society, and just anybody who's traveled on the ferry in the years past would have known Brian, and a wonderful person to have known. And I know Wolfe Island especially will miss him, as we will as well. The third announcement is to remind you that on June the 6th, we will have our annual commemoration of Sir John A. Macdonald at the graveside. If it is wet, it'll be in the old stone Christchurch. You're all welcome. It is not a long service. Duncan will talk about who is speaking and remind you that as last year, we have the transported Kingston Trio, now living in Canada, who lead us in the singing of Old Canada. And that's worth coming just to hear them sing. So this evening, Duncan, can you introduce our speaker?
Good evening. I'm Duncan McDowell, and welcome to the fifth of our spring lectures. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Christine Lavallee. In preparation for that, let me remark, as we all know, that over the last few months, Canada and Canadians have been under unprecedented strain over our economic, political, and cultural identity. And in times of duress, societies take comfort in their strengths. The theme of Canada Strong is very much present in our society these days. We watch hockey these days because it's Canada's game. We also take pride in our literary cultures, in particular the eloquence and world renown of our women writers. Our history has been punctuated by Canadian women who take pen in hand and have won fame and readership around the world. The list is long. Susanna Moodie, Catherine Parr Traill, Sarah Jeanette Duncan, L.M. Montgomery, right down to the present with names like Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, Emma Donoghue, commanding our respect. On that list are many Kingston women, Agnes Maulmacher, Janet Turner Hospital, Bronwyn Wallace, and Helen Humphrey, to name just a few. Today's speaker will add a pioneering name to that list. Christine Lavallee is a graduate in English literature from the University of Victoria. She continued with library studies at Mohawk College. Amongst her many interests, Christine has developed a fascination for romance novels. When employment at St. Lawrence brought her to Kingston, her passion for literature prompted her to investigate the folklore of Canada's first fiction author, a Kingstonian woman, Julia Beckwith Hart. So without further ado, welcome, Christine.
Thank you. I really appreciate that introduction. I think it's a very well thought out one, considering the time that we're in. I wanted to first off say really appreciated Paul and Duncan's help in making sure that this could be virtual. To the life changes, I am not able to be there in person, but I really enjoy my correspondence with the Society thus far. I want to start with a land acknowledgement when I'm speaking to you online, but one of the main reasons I wanted to recognize that this book was a colonial book was because one of the minor characters that actually has a fairly important role in the novel was addressed as an Indian. And while I do think the author was very progressive and forward thinking for her time, she did come with a colonial perspective. So, with that in mind, I just wanted to state that Kingston is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Haudenosaunee peoples. As the speakers have already mentioned, I originally started getting involved with romance novels during the pandemic. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I really wanted to get to know the history behind the novels. I know that's a very niche topic to get interested in, but during the pandemic, I found a lot of inspiration in the novels, and I wanted to know more about the authors who had written them, and I wanted to know what was Canada's side of that, because we all know that British have Jane Austen, and I wanted to know who started the Canadian novel, especially in terms of fiction. So that helped me helped me learn more about Julia Beckwith Hart. And since I was in Kingston at the time, it seemed like it was meant to be, because I was not only working at an academic library, but I also was in the very same city where she published her first novel. So that was very meaningful to me. And for about, as I said, for 2 or 3 years, I have been learning more about her and the other authors. And I have just been really inspired by her story, and I hope I can inspire you about her life and also help you recognize why she's still relevant for us today. So this is one of the first projects I worked on when I was working at the academic library independently, because I wanted to get a very good visual understanding of how long it's taken for the romance novel to evolve in Canada, and in essence, the fiction novel. This is a screenshot of a Google map that I first started working on. 2 years ago. I would say 2 or 3 years ago. And as you can see, a lot of the novels come from like I would say Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, which makes sense given where a lot of the colonial events were happening and the forts that were being built. And a lot of the authors from that time period have a lot of insightful views of that time period that we can learn about. And so when you take into consideration, I don't want to say the word sparse, but there are very few authors coming from certain areas of Canada. When you take that into consideration, you can understand how long it's taking for the fiction novel to be accepted as a form of entertainment and even a form of writing in its own right. Especially when you consider that Julia Hart's novel was first published in 1824. I can actually define what a romance novel and why that's important. So romance novels they're often considered as less academic and not as relevant as literature. And one thing I have to emphasize, because of my experience researching romance novels, is that it's not the same as romantic literature. In my experience, romantic literature has really emphasized more the sense of philosophical themes and less on entertainment. And while in literature can be entertaining, I would argue that that's not the focal point of literature. You can also go through the viewpoint that romance novels need to have a love story at the center of it. And one novel that one nonfiction novel that really helped me get to understand what the definition of a romance novel should be is the natural history of the romance novel by Dr. Pamela Regis from the States. And in her perspective, in order to be a romance novel, the book has to have obstacles for the couples to overcome in order to have a satisfying ending. And it's very interesting because I actually attended a romance novel event last week. And one thing that all the romance authors emphasized was that not only does it have to have a happy ending, the novel, but it also has to have that satisfying conclusion at the end, because to them it felt like they were portraying their readers. It would be like if a mystery writer wrote a mystery novel but didn't reveal who the villain was at the end. It would just be not unthinkable for the mystery author to do that. In the same way, romance authors know that they have to deliver certain things to the romance reader. And so if you consider all of that, it shouldn't be a surprise that tragedies, romantic tragedies in particular, no longer fit the modern definition of a romance novel. So examples like that would be Romeo and Juliet and Water for Elephants. So a lot of romance authors will get defensive about the idea of calling a romance novel a novel with a sad ending a romance, because they know that they need to deliver a happy ending for their readers. So I have gotten asked, why would I want to research romance novels, and why would I want to consider fiction relevant? So I personally believe that fiction novels really reflect the changes occurring in our current day society. They also reflect what the challenges are for people coming from minority backgrounds. It also brings up the importance of freedom to read. If you look at a lot of banned book lists or books that have been challenged, a lot of books that have been challenged or banned recently from libraries, and school libraries in particular, will have themes about gender, sexuality, and romance. And I just want to emphasize that I do believe that parents have the authority to and the empowerment to be involved with their child's reading journey. But it is worth considering and discussing why are these books in particular that are appearing on these banned and challenged book lists. And to also consider the most popular genre in the publishing industry, according to Book Riot, and that was last year. It has managed to have created thousands and thousands of dollars for authors in the romance genre, and it's still considered one of the most popular genres to date. So it's also known as part of art history, which may come as a surprise with people. This is something that I happily discovered on Instagram through this hashtag called Step Back Saturday, and I want to show some examples for why I consider it part of art history. So if you're not sure what a step back is, back when Harlequin Romance and Avon, when the more modern publishers started to release romance novels as we know them today, one of the ways that they would market their novels was by adding more art at the back of the front cover, and these were usually either a one-page spread, two-page spread at the back of the cover. And what's interesting to note is that some of these illustrators are actually men, and I think it emphasizes that romance is for everybody. And these examples were happily contributed by one of my friends on Instagram, and these are actually from Canadian authors, books by Canadian authors, and some of the authors who have had setbacks are still very popular today. Some of them include Mary Balog and Marcia Canna, and they've all done historical romance novels. And I think it just goes to show that we can find art in any aspect of literature. Okay, so a little bit of background, as I don't know where everyone's coming from in their knowledge of romance novels. But one platform I wanted to start off talking about is the literary garland. This is where a lot of notable early Canadian authors, particularly women, started to get a platform for their work, including Susanna Moodie. There wasn't a lot of romance novels that I could find from the literary garland, as that was from 1796 to 1867. But I think it goes to show that even back then, Canadians were looking for platforms that were not only developed by Canadians, but were also for Canadians. So while it did have other authors from America and England, they did try to focus heavily on Canadian authors as well. So American publishers were understandably another form of how Canadians were able to publish their books. One example I can give is Ella Montgomery, even though she's happily embraced it as a Canadian author, and all her books are predominantly set in PEI. She was traditionally published initially by an American publisher. So that was just one way that Canadian authors managed to find fame. So Harlequin romance is something that I love to talk about because not many people know that it was started in Winnipeg, and that was back in 1949. And that was when a lot of medical romances were very popular, but it's really interesting to me that Harlequin romance was founded by a fur trader who eventually got into the publishing industry, and then his wife noticed that medical romances were very popular and really encouraged him to start producing those. And today they're still very popular, even though, I shouldn't say even though, they no longer are based in Winnipeg, but they are predominantly based in Toronto. And one thing that I found really interesting in my research was dime novels from Quebec. And as an English speaker and writer, it's hard for me to find a lot of novels that have been translated into from French. But I had found some researchers who were looking into dime novels, and these were predominantly for the middle class, as they were cheap forms of entertainment that were becoming affordable for them. And that was, I just want to get the date right, that was 1940 to 1965. And so when we talk about romance today, I really want to emphasize how much it's been embraced by everyone online and at home. And even though it started from 1824 to 2000, there's been a strong emphasis on embracing people from different backgrounds. And I would say a really good example of that is Mary Balog, as she really emphasized the importance of representing people with disabilities, even in her early romance novels. And I think the reason that's really important is that people are able to see and recognize themselves when they're represented in those novels, and they can feel encouraged by the positive themes that are in romance novels, while also exploring more challenging topics like mental health. And those topics have definitely changed over time as society has become more aware of the importance of learning about them. So some notable trailblazers. I should emphasize that my research really focuses on the authors from 1824 to 2000. And as I mentioned before, there are some challenges without not being able to speak French or read it. But one author who has gained fame in Quebec is Rosanna Leperon, and she has a very dramatic romance called Antoinette de Mirecourt, and she is an author from Montreal. And then Winifred Eaton is a Canadian author of Asian descent. And then Evelyn Eaton is possibly the first indigenous fiction author that I was able to find. I do find this fairly tricky because, as I mentioned, like the fiction novel didn't come to form in Canada until 1824. So with that in mind, it's important to recognize that Indigenous writers had their own form of sharing stories. But when it comes to the fiction novel, I do believe Evelyn Eaton is the first Indigenous author to write fiction with Canadian roots. But I want to do a quick introduction of our author. So who was she? She was first born in 1796 in to two very colorful and impressive parents. So I'm going to first start off with her own childhood before I shift into her family history. So she was a teenager during the War of 1812, which I think is very important to remember because that war really helped form Canada as we know it today. And you can see her maturity in the way that she grasps the themes of war in her novel, which is so impactful as a reader when you remember that she was just a teenager when all these events were happening. She was also a teacher at a girls' boarding school, which I found really fascinating because when I was researching for newspapers that referenced her, they did discuss what she was teaching and how much it cost. So just being able to have that firsthand account of what was expected to be a boarder at her school was really fascinating. And I want to emphasize that when she was doing this, when she was a teacher, that part was in Kingston. She moved from Fredericton to Kingston after the death of her father, but I'll explain more of that in the next slide. I just wanted to summarize a little bit about who she was as an individual first. So, as an author, she was the proud author of 2.5 books, and I say 2.5 books because she only officially published 2 books during her lifetime, and that the first one was St. Ursula's Convent, or The Nun of Canada, which was published in 1824 in Kingston, and then the other one was called Tonwante, also published in 1824, but surprisingly not in Canada, because after her brief publishing adventure in Kingston, she and her family decided to live in Rochester, New York. That was for a very brief time, but that's where she published her second novel. And then when they moved back to Fredericton, she managed to get her novel, Edith or the Doom. I don't want to say it wasn't fully published, but parts of it was published in 1851. So it never was traditionally published in the same sense as St. Ursula's Convent was. Now, this is a personal opinion of my own, but I believe that through her literary preferences, that she was an abolitionist and was very forward-thinking in her views about ending slavery. And 2 other aspects that will become important later was that she was a mother and also a Christian, specifically a Methodist. And when I explain more about her family, and this will be an important aspect of how she writes her novels. I wanted to include this map because it really shows what life was like for Julia Hart and her family during the War of 1812, and this is like probably the most contemporary map I could find that Julia Hart could relate to. And so, as you can see, Ontario and Quebec didn't exist as we knew it back then, but Julia Hart knew Ontario and Quebec and that area as Upper and Lower Canada. And I think that's really important to remember. You can also see the St. Lawrence River, which is another important landscape feature in her novel. So I really wanted to get into her family for good reason, because they were huge influence on her writing. So I want to emphasize her grandfather was a very colorful character and was a little notorious due to his infamous fame. He originally arrived in Quebec under General Montcalm, and I don't know how familiar everyone is about Canadian history, but General Montcalm was a very famous general and military leader in New France and was very involved with the wars. So Julia Hart's father in particular came with under his leadership, and he was considered an artillery scrivener, or essentially he was a hired writer for the military. Now, an important thing to mention is that he was actually a turncoat after being arrested. He initially supported the French, but after being arrested for theft, he switched sides and supported the British. Unfortunately, there are records emphasizing that he abused his position as a lawyer, and I personally believe this is one of the reasons why Hart's mother tried to distance herself from him, because she was most likely the governess to General Carleton's nieces. And it's very interesting as a scholar to notice that General Carleton in particular tried to end Hart's her grandfather's career as a lawyer. And there is just a very bad blood between the two of them because General Carleton disapproved of Hart's grandfather's practices. So I wanted to also bring up her father was a well-known shipbuilder, and unfortunately had a bit of a run-in with Benedict Arnold, who is known as an infamous traitor in American history. Essentially what happened, there are different takes of what transpired between the two individuals. But according to historians and to one of their descendants, Beckwith had agreed to deliver a ship on time for Benedict Arnold to use, and he wasn't able to meet those important deadlines. So unfortunately, whatever occurred between the two caused Nehemiah Beckwith to go into debt. Later on, he died by drowning, and there are theories that it might have been robbery gone bad, but there is no confirmation of this. Regardless of what caused his death, the important thing is that his death really impacted Hart's mother financially, especially as a mother back in the 19th century. So in order to help elevate the financial burden on her mother, Julia Beckwith at the time moved to Kingston to live with Catholic relatives, which is really interesting because her mother denounced her Catholic faith. But even though Hart's mother, sorry, I use Beckwith and Hart, I didn't use them interchangeably. But even though Julia Hart's mother denounced her faith, she still was very close to her family throughout her lifetime and entrusted her daughter with them. So Hart was able to start a new life in Kingston, and that's actually where she started her boarding school and married her husband, who was a bookbinder when they met. So I think it's really amazing that she and her husband shared a love of books, and a lot of scholars agree that that's potentially how Julia Hart found connections to get her book published. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, but this is a first edition of St. Ursula's Convent, and this copy in particular is at Brock University's archives, and they were more than willing to send me a copy of it for my research. And the important thing for study, I believe, is to note that her novel was published in 2 volumes, and this isn't particularly of importance when you're considering that back then, one of the ways that readers would have read the novel was through circulation libraries, and this meant that subscribers could rent out 1 or 2 volumes at a time at like 1 or 2 shillings per month for as a cost. And I was able to see St. Ursula's Convent being advertised in newspapers. So this is a brief summary that I came up personally, as there's not a lot of summaries of this novel online, unfortunately, but I'm hoping that we can promote this summary more. So as a brief summary, St. Ursula's Convent is a Gothic romance set in Georgian Canada. After her father loses his merchant ship, Julia's family moves to Canada from France, where they find new beginnings. Sadly, Julia finds out that her husband has gone missing during the siege of Quebec. Numbed by a series of personal losses, Julia becomes a nun and takes the name of Mother St. Catherine. Even though she remains in the shelter of the convent walls, the world still finds her through the presence of young girls coming to the convent for education. One of them is the innocent Adelaide, whose own dramatic love story helps unravel the truth about Julia's husband. I personally think this novel is ideal for fans of Jane Eyre and Georgette Hare, and I think anyone who loves a Gothic novel will definitely be right at home reading this. So I think it's really important to discuss Hart's writing style, in particular when it comes to how she was writing in the 19th century. So it should come as no surprise that as a 19th century writer, she loved lengthy sentences, used dramatic word choices. And one thing you will notice that in order to emphasize how time changes or that there's been a dramatic scene, she will create line breaks, and also there'll be lines in between the paragraphs for the reader to actually emphasize that, to recognize that there's an emphasis on the spaces between the paragraphs. And I personally feel that that's her way of creating a more dramatic flair to the novel. And themes that I particularly enjoyed as a scholar were themes of identity and the seigneurial feudal system, which was one of the ways that New France orchestrated and divided land and had their own sense of society back then. So important influences were the Gothic literature. So even back in her time, a lot of Gothic literature were becoming popular in the newspapers, I should say. And you can definitely see their influence in her writing and how she creates this convent as almost a castle for her protagonist. And also, I love to say that she was indeed influenced by Jane Austen. Then the year that she started writing her novel as a teenager was the same year that Persuasion came out, and I do personally believe that her novel was influenced by Jane Austen's writing. She also had 2 Catholic family members who she corresponded with, and you can definitely tell that she was shaped by their life as a priest and a nun, and I like to think that that broadened her understanding of different religions and different backgrounds. And despite this, I do have to note that there is some anti-Catholic rhetoric, and that was quite popular at the time due to the tension between England and France, but this was primarily to heighten the sensationalism in her novel. And I don't personally believe that it was to paint her family in any bad light like that. So I'm going to summarize this really quick. I think I have noticed the time. But Hugh C. Thompson was a business mogul and politician who lived from 1791 to 1834. And that is a very flattering photo of a miniature that I found at Queen's University of him. And there is another miniature matching his of his wife that can be found there. Unfortunately, it's just a picture of the miniature, but it is of their likeness. So I think it's very interesting that he was buried in Kingston, and his grave can be found at the lower burial ground in Kingston downtown. So I did want to credit real quick some previous researchers on Julia Hart. The most important one I want to address tonight is Phileas Gagnon. He was a bibliophile and just a passionate researcher on early Canadian literature, and he did a lot of research on Julia Hart and even managed to correspond with one of her sons. And I was able to find some of his letters, which were very revealing and insightful for me. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for how much work he did. His archives can be found at the Archives in Montreal, and that's a photo of him on the right-hand side. So I will summarize this, but some of the important archival remains I was able to find was that 77 Princess Street is one of the closest standing buildings that I can find that is associated with Julia Hart. There was an architectural historian who I was able to talk to, and she believes that 77 Princess Street is also the coffee shop where it was next to the coffee shop where Hart's husband used to work at as a bookbinder. And I think it's just great that we still have that physical evidence still standing. Although it's kind of funny right now because it's actually considered an antique store downtown, but just goes to show that that building is full of history. Also, I was able to trace back through death certificates more information about Julia Hart's husband, and also this painting of her brother was recently restored, which I think is really important because he was the mayor of Fredericton. So it's great to be able to have a painting of one of her relatives. Another really interesting part about 19th century novels, one of the way that they were able to get financial support is by promoting the novel in newspapers ahead of time, similar to how authors might get newsletters out or have a Kickstarter today. And a few themes that I found in the subscribers list of names was a lot of them were prominent figures in Kingston and Fredericton. But what's interesting to note is that a lot of them had conflicting views on religion and race. So I just find that so interesting in comparison to today and how similar that is, as romance can touch the hearts of everyone, regardless of where you stand politically. I believe that romance novels have an important message for everyone. And I'll go next, but if you want to hear more about Canada's Last Duel, you can follow me on Substack, and I'll have more information there for you. But I can provide that information more later. Okay, so I know I talked a lot, and I hopefully haven't overwhelmed you with too much information. But I was so passionate about this topic, and I am going to admit that I was a full-on nerd when it came to Julia Beckwith Hart. That I went as far as submitting a proposal for Heritage Minutes, and as far as I understand it, they're very interested in producing a minute for her. If you don't know what those are, they're very high quality productions that are usually 1 to 3 minutes long, and they really focus on important people and important events in Canadian history. And I personally think having a minute on Canada's first fiction novel would be amazing and would really help validate fiction more in Canada. And so these two are the two last things I wanted to mention that are I'm hoping will happen if things fall into place and the powers that be come together. I'm in the process of reaching out to the right people and hopefully adapting St. Ursula's Convent into a play. I have gotten enough feedback to know that there would be support to financially help produce it. But right now, I have to really focus on writing it as a as a script, and I've never done that before. So I am hoping that I will meet the right people and get the right advice for that. And another thing that I'm hoping that will come to be in the next year or so is a physical edition of St. Ursula's Convent. To life changes. I wasn't able to get that far, but I will be able to send out an ebook format of the novel if that's of interest to the audience. And that's free access. I just really wanted more Canadians to know about this novel. I'm really passionate about it. So I'm hoping that the play and hopefully the Heritage Minute will help Canadians understand where our fiction came from, where our first romance novel came from, and who Julia Beckwith Hart was. So hopefully I didn't talk your ear off too. But I'm really glad I was able to share my passion with you. But I'm more than happy to take questions from you. And if you have any thoughts or concerns, oh yes, I do know if you wanted to get into this, but since we're speeding ahead, we can definitely do it. So this goes into the modern understanding and full on passion readers have of what it means to be a romance reader. So today I can definitely recommend 2 romance bookstores that are woman owned. I should say female owned. And one of them is Slow Burn Books in Alberta, and the other one is called Hopeless Romantic Books in Toronto. And throughout the year, there are events and conferences that celebrate romance readers and romance authors, and it's become very community-based, which I love and just really, really appreciate. If you want to find out more about the events, I definitely encourage you to go on Instagram and to look up just different platforms like Canlit Romance. She has an amazing resource for everyone to find a list of the authors and the events that are taking place in Canada. For further resources, I would recommend the Database of Canada's Early Women Writers, and this was created by the amazing Dr. Carol Gerson, who is a retired English professor from SFU in Alberta, and she took it upon herself to create this database to have a platform that would make it easy for researchers to find all the writers, including, and not just writers who write literature, but also journalists, playwriters, the whole shebang. You can find them there. And I will definitely include these resources later in the follow-up email that you'll be getting. But if you're looking for an Indigenous perspective on fiction, I do recommend Brave Good Minds.
Thank you, Christine, for bringing your lecture to a happy ending. We're all floating away from it now, as a good romance novel should. We're happy to take questions now. Here we are. If you could speak up, please.
Yes, my question is, do we have any idea as to how many copies of St. Ursula's Convent were printed?
I can definitely get the number for you. So in the first round, what Hugh C. Thompson did was when he got the subscribers, you can see how many were ordered by them, and when you look up the first edition online, you can see their names, and then there's the city that they hailed from, and then you can see the number of copies. But I'm sorry I don't have the number with me right now, but I will definitely get that to you guys.
Go ahead.
Not to ask too many questions, but I have,
Go ahead.
do we have any idea if that book had an influence on other writers in other countries?
So I want to say she did, but I have a personal feeling that her career was fairly short and sweet. I don't think that should be too surprising though, because fiction novels at the time that she wrote them were not very well embraced. But I think it goes to show how far we've gone and our sense and appreciation of literature and reading as a whole as a country to now make that a very common thing to see in our bookshelves.
Christine, any idea of how the Catholic Church responded to the novel? One of the points you made about
That's a very
the
good
novel.
question. So I can't say how the Catholic Church would have responded, but I know that she was in correspondence with her mother's cousin, who was a Catholic priest, and he was a well-known Catholic French historian, and so I can only imagine that he might have found interest in her novel and might have had a few interesting things to say, as one of her antagonists is a bit of an evil priest, but he does, the interesting thing to note is that he does get a chance to ask forgiveness for what he's done. So I do think there might have been some influence in that when it came to her Catholic family members.
You're quite right about the novels reflecting the mid-19th century religious animosity in Canada and around the world. In those same years, one of the great show women of the time was a woman called the Nun of Canmare in Ireland, who had left the Catholic Church and toured North America, making a lot of money, revealing what she claimed were the sordid secrets of the Catholic Church. I don't know.
I came across books like that, and I think a part of it was fueled by a lot of animosity towards Catholics, and I personally believe it's one of the reasons why Hart's mother denounced her faith, because you'll notice when you read the novel, it's just one line, but there is reference to Acadian history, and I think Hart was very aware of how Acadians were facing expulsion during all the turmoil, and how Catholics weren't really embraced in the Maritimes. So Julia Hart in particular has been noted by scholars for trying to separate herself from her Catholic French roots, and I'm sure the pressure of having a notorious father who was a scandalous lawyer probably didn't want her to be really associated with that too much. But she had a very dramatic family, so I'm sure she had her own view of Catholics. But I wanted to also emphasize, when she moved to Kingston, it was actually Catholic relatives that she stayed with.
We probably remember, or we should remember, that in Kingston, Catholics and Protestants were literally at each other's throats. When the Prince of Wales visited in 1861, there was such fear that if he came ashore and was feted by the Orangemen, that there would be riots. So thanks largely to the engineering of John A. Macdonald, he stayed on his yacht and toured along the harbor front, and everyone could wave but not engage the foes. That's how deep these pensions were in 19th century society. All right.
For Christine, I just said, thank you, Christine. You're obviously very passionate about your interest in romance novels and your writing. You've put a lot of time and thought into it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah.
You're welcome.
No, I'm definitely. I apologize if I wasn't able to get to everything. I'll definitely. I have a Substack that you can follow. I was trying to be aware of the time. So I hope you enjoy it.
Bet you could elaborate on that duel.
Okay. Well, I can definitely refer to my Substack more for this because I had such a fun time getting into all the gossip and everything about the subscribers back in the day and what they were involved in. So there are actually two really notorious duels that happened in Canada. And so the one I'll get into was a lot of this happened between lawyers. And the reason I think Hart was connected to this, to her subscribers, is because her brother was a mayor, and so he definitely had connections there. And anyone back then wanted to get into law school and like be a lawyer to have influence. And so it's a bit of a case of mistaken identity. And essentially what happened was a lawyer attempted to get another person arrested for I think it was due to their different opinions of slavery. And what happened essentially was the wrong man was arrested. And so, of course, the embarrassment of being arrested for under the wrong pretenses was enough to cause a duel. And I don't want to mix things up, but I'm pretty sure that was a situation where the man survived. But it's a very odd thing with duels. Like, you think that once you do it once, you will never do it again. But the same man wanted to have another duel with another person, so I think it just ran in his blood to have more duels in his life. So the subscribers were actually relatives of this man who was harmed in the duel. And I don't want to mix up the facts, but I'll let some stats speak for itself. But I'll definitely it was a case of mistaken identity. I will leave it at that. But it is a little crazy how duels get out of hand in 19th century Canada.
Yes. If you're in Perth, Ontario, you can visit Last Duel Park, and there's plaquing and the same narrative we just heard. It's interesting. They make something of it for their tourism. Christine, you mentioned Harlequin romances. Now, as I understand it, that was phenomenally successful as an export, translated into 20, 30 languages around the world. Is it still going?
It is still going. It's become a bit of a juggernaut in historical romance in particular. I find it so fascinating because when it first started out, it was predominantly focusing on dramatic novels, but because of the founder's wife, he decided to look more into romance novels, and originally they were pretty they had a pretty standard plot line that followed medical romance essentially, but I think it's really important to not just sort of try to use those terms in a way to summarize them, because I think we're doing a disservice of not realizing or emphasizing that even back then, writers were trying to tackle different issues like the health system and gender rights. But today, they're really emphasizing that romance and fiction is for everyone, and they're still very strong in emphasizing the romance appeal to readers. And obviously they have other competitors, like Kobo is now a very popular ebook platform in Toronto. And it's really, I think it's really awesome that we're having more platforms nowadays. But another one, Wattpad is another competitor in Canada for Harlequin. But yes, Harlequin romance is very, very strong in their romance novels.
Can you speculate, has the romance novel genre been adopted by gay couples?
Yes. It's a bit hard for them because the marketing is you can never like predict what people gravitate towards. And obviously that can be quite political nowadays. But I think it's really important for people who are fans of those works to promote those on their platform, because a lot of LGBT authors may not feel comfortable enough sharing their story or promoting their work, so they might want to go indie. And the problem is with indie is that it is really expensive. So there's all these like pros and cons that come with indie, but if you can find a fan base that works well with the book that you're promoting, you can go viral. But I'm hoping LGBT will and minorities from all over will find a bigger platform. But I do want to emphasize that people working at Harlequin and like other publishers have made huge strides in making sure that everyone feels that they have a romance novel that they can feel that they're being represented in. And also they have imprints, which are essentially focused. Well, their imprints are smaller publishers owned by a bigger publisher that have a specific niche to their books, and they have created certain ones for LGBT. So I do see them being more embraced today.
I'm struck in listening to you when you watch on television the ads for places like Sandals and Getaway Holidays in the Sun. They are in fact mimicking the romance novels, a guy and a girl having a wonderful carefree time, finding each other. And now creeping into that are gay couples in advertising. A bit surreptitious at first, but it's pretty clear that they see an option here for it. But it's all, you know, so many of the covers you showed us of the handsome guy with the muscles and no shirt. I picked that.
I wasn't sure about that
Fine girl should take the shirt off.
Okay?
But the covers are just like the Sandals ads.
That's true. They were one thing that I noticed, and I don't want to become too political, but I did notice that those novels were becoming very popular when feminism was developing, and women were becoming more comfortable expressing their own desires. And when I say that, I don't mean that every novel, a romance novel, emphasizes that in the same way. Like they're not all 50 Shades of Grey, and not that women can't express themselves in the way that has been done in 50 Shades of Grey. But there are things like closed door romance novels or sweet romance novels where some authors don't feel that they have to be that revealing in terms of body parts or like sexuality, because they have what's called fade to black scenes, and they want to ensure that everyone feels safe as a reader and reads at their own pace. But at the same time, you will have very popular writers finding popularity with books that do the opposite. So there is honestly a wide range of what's being portrayed in novels and what's being discussed in novels, which I think also reflects advertisements, because as I mentioned before, romance novels really pick up what's being allowed and what's being challenged in society. And I think that's why romance novels often make the banned or challenged book list.
Any other questions? Well, I guess we're at the fade to black point. Christine, I really want to thank, as our comment online said, for showing your passion for this topic. And it's one thing to have passion, but it's another thing to have the kind of diligence to do the research and really tell the story, which you have done tonight. So we wish you well. We hope you get a Heritage Minute, maybe even a play. Or maybe even coming to a theater near us. But thank you so much and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for coming. And I'll reiterate Peter Gower, our president's comment. Do join us on the 6th of June at Cataraqui Cemetery, where we will honor Sir John A. Macdonald, the day of his death. We don't use the word celebrate John A. Macdonald because John A. Macdonald was a man like you and I, a man of potential, a man who made mistakes, but a man ultimately who put this country together and deserves to be recognized. So do join us. We have a very good speaker in Roy McSkimming, who has written about Macdonald and Laurier and as a journalist. We have a piper, fittingly for the Scottish aspect of it. A short service, but a meaningful service. So do join us on the 6th of June. Our next lecture won't come until September, when Susan Smith, the editor of the Thousand Islands magazine, will be here to tell us about her long and very successful work chronicling the heritage of the Thousand Islands. And if you don't know it, just go online to Thousand Islands magazine and see what she produces each month and her authors. So again, thank you and have a good summer. Thank you.